Imagine realizing that the secret to running a thriving business wasn't in the numbers or profits, but in the way you treat your employees. That's exactly what Thomas Miller discovered, and it changed everything. It was just another afternoon, a typical one in a suburban supermarket in Los Angeles, California. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting their sterile glow over rows of neatly stocked shelves. A cacophony of shopping carts, clicking heels, and distant chatter filled the air. Thomas Miller, the owner of a growing chain of supermarkets, had decided to slip in quietly, just like any other customer. The store was busy, nothing unusual. But to Thomas, it was a rare opportunity to see how his business was really running, how his employees treated the people who walked through the doors every day. He had done the usual management meetings, the boardroom reports. But this would be different. This would be real. Dressed in a simple, unassuming polo shirt and jeans, Thomas blended in well with the crowd. His brown hair was slightly tousled, his glasses rested comfortably on the bridge of his nose. No one would recognize him. To the staff, he was just another face in the crowd. That was exactly what he wanted. The anonymity would give him a chance to observe things without the polite facade people put up when they knew the boss was watching. He passed through the aisles, the steady rhythm of his steps falling in sync with the shoppers around him. The produce section, the dairy aisle, the shelves of canned goods, everything seemed to be in place. The store was clean, well organized. Yet, as Thomas walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The employees, while polite, were going through the motions. There was no spark, no warmth. A smile here and there, but nothing that spoke of genuine care for the customers. He watched as a cashier greeted a customer with a forced smile, hardly looking them in the eye, quickly scanning the items without saying much more than, "Hi, how are you?" and "That'll be £42.50. The exchange was transactional. Efficient, yes, but impersonal. As Thomas observed, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the norm across his stores. Were the employees simply following the script? Was this the culture he had unknowingly fostered? As he approached the checkout lanes, he took note of the staff behind the counters. A young man, probably in his early 20s, was scanning groceries with robotic precision. His eyes barely lifted from the register as the line grew longer. A few feet away, an older woman, in her 50s, seemed more interested in chatting with a colleague than engaging with the next customer. Thomas frowned slightly, making a mental note. But then he noticed her. Jasmine Carter, standing at the end of one of the lanes. She was in her mid-20s, with a kind expression that softened her sharp features. As he watched, she interacted with the customers ahead of him, genuinely listening, making eye contact, and even cracking a joke here and there. It wasn't just about the job for Jasmine. There was something else, a warmth, a humanity that was missing elsewhere. Thomas moved closer, still trying to blend in. He had no idea what he was looking for yet. Perhaps it was simply curiosity, or maybe he just needed to confirm what he had feared. The line was moving slower than he had anticipated, a few impatient customers tapping their feet behind him. But Jasmine never faltered. Each interaction, no matter how routine, was met with her full attention. She asked how the day had been, noticed when someone seemed upset, and even went the extra mile to help an elderly woman bag her groceries without being asked. It wasn't exceptional, but it was rare. And to Thomas, it stood out in a way he hadn't expected. As he stepped forward to her register, Thomas couldn't help but observe her with a growing sense of admiration. She didn't just work here, she lived the service. His turn came. The line behind him was growing, but Jasmine's focus was entirely on him as she began ringing up his items. The usual pleasantries began. "Hello, how's your day going?" she asked with a genuine smile. And for the first time that afternoon, Thomas found himself smiling back. But there was something more, something that made him pause and really think. Would you have done things differently than the others? Was it really just about the job for Jasmine? The line behind Thomas grew longer as more customers piled in, pushing carts laden with groceries, each of them growing more impatient by the minute. He could feel the subtle tension in the air, people huffing, shifting from foot to foot, checking their watches, all waiting for the line to move faster. But even in the face of this pressure, Jasmine remained calm, almost serene, as she methodically scanned the items in front of her, never rushing, never faltering. Her pace was steady, each beep of the scanner like a soft reassurance that she was in control. Thomas stood there for a moment, taking it all in. He couldn't help but notice how different her demeanor was compared to the others. The other cashiers seemed to work mechanically, like they were ticking off a list. There was no personal connection, no attempt to make the customer feel heard or valued. One woman was chatting aimlessly to her colleague, barely acknowledging the elderly woman at her counter as she hurriedly bagged her groceries. Another cashier barely looked up from the register, muttering a brief "hi," as a young father with a toddler in tow quickly shuffled through. It was efficient, but it wasn't real. It wasn't personal. Jasmine, however, seemed to understand that the transaction wasn't just about the exchange of money for goods. It was about people. A small gesture, a few kind words, an acknowledgement of someone's existence could make all the difference in the world. The customers ahead of Thomas seemed to recognize this too. They smiled at her, engaged in small talk, and even exchanged a few laughs. Jasmine was making a difference in her own subtle way. Still, Thomas couldn't help but wonder why no one else had picked up on this. Were the other cashiers simply indifferent, or was it that no one had shown them how to really connect with customers? Were they, like the others he had observed earlier, simply going through the motions, ticking off boxes on some invisible checklist? He leaned back, his mind churning with questions. What was missing here? Why did it seem so obvious with Jasmine but invisible to the others? As he stood there, deep in thought, a flash of movement caught his attention. A customer in front of him, a man with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap, seemed to be getting more agitated by the second. He was tapping his fingers on the counter, muttering under his breath, casting impatient glances at Jasmine as she carefully bagged his groceries. His irritation was palpable, his body language tense. Thomas could see it all. The small movements of frustration, the clenched jaw, the tightening fists. Jasmine noticed too. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. Instead, she took a deep breath and smiled gently at him. "Looks like you're in a bit of a hurry," she said, her voice soft but confident. "Is there anything I can do to help speed things along?" The man paused. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment Thomas thought he might snap at her. But then something unexpected happened. The man let out a small laugh, almost embarrassed by his own impatience. "Yeah, sorry," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just got a lot on my plate today." Jasmine nodded sympathetically. "I get it. It's one of those days, huh?" She didn't press for details, but her words had a calming effect. The man's posture softened, and he let out a sigh, clearly relieved. Jasmine finished scanning his items, handed him the bag with a smile, and wished him a good day. It wasn't much, but it was enough to change the mood of the entire interaction. The man left the counter with a slightly lighter step. His frustration dissolved, if only for a moment. Thomas watched all of this unfold, his thoughts racing. What was it about Jasmine that made her different? Was it just her demeanor, or was there something more? He thought back to his earlier observations, about the other cashiers, the mechanical motions, the lack of personal connection. It was clear now. Jasmine wasn't just doing a job. She was engaging with people in a way that the others weren't. Her kindness wasn't an act. It was real. It wasn't forced. It wasn't part of some corporate policy or a training manual. It came from within. But was it enough to change the course of Thomas's day, or was he simply overthinking it? As Thomas's turn came closer, his mind was still swirling with thoughts about the other cashiers. Why did they seem so detached, so distant? Was it burnout, or was it something deeper? Jasmine, on the other hand, had brought a warmth to the counter that felt entirely genuine, and in that moment, he felt a pang of realization. He had spent so many years focused on profit margins, growth, and expansion that he had completely overlooked what truly mattered. "Good afternoon?" Jasmine greeted him brightly, her smile never faltering as she scanned the first item. Her voice was warm, without a hint of the monotony he had heard from the others. For a moment, Thomas almost forgot that he was just another customer in line. He was just a man, talking to someone who cared. He returned her smile, suddenly self-conscious. "Hello," he said, his voice almost sounding awkward in comparison. He shuffled his feet for a moment, unsure of how to engage. Jasmine's eyes met his, and she raised her eyebrows in a playful way, clearly picking up on his discomfort. "How's your day going?" she asked casually. still making eye contact as she rang up his items. Her tone was light, almost as if they were old friends. Thomas didn't know why, but it felt comforting. "It's going well, thanks." "How about yours?" he responded, realizing only then that he hadn't given much thought to his day up until that point. Maybe it wasn't about the supermarket or even the transactions. Maybe it was about connecting with people. Jasmine's hands moved swiftly over the items, packing the groceries with careful attention. "Busy, like usual. But I like it that way." She gave him a glance as though inviting him to share in her sentiment. "You know how it is. People need their essentials." "Yeah, I suppose so," Thomas replied, his voice now more relaxed as he watched her work. There was an ease about her, an authenticity that made it hard to stay in his usual business mindset. Jasmine was just real, but even as they exchanged small talk, Thomas couldn't shake the thought that something was off. Why had he never noticed this side of his employees? He'd been so wrapped up in the logistics, the numbers, the bottom line. How had he missed the simple but essential humanity behind his company? He thought back to the corporate meetings, the reports, the quarterly earnings. None of that had prepared him for this simple, yet profound moment. Jasmine finished ringing up his last item, and Thomas quickly realized how much time had passed. He hadn't even noticed the line behind him growing longer. As she bagged his groceries, he hesitated. There was a growing urge inside him to ask more, something deeper than the usual customer interaction. But how could he? "Are you always like this?" he asked suddenly, before he could stop himself. He realized he sounded strange, too curious, too eager. But the question hung in the air between them, and Jasmine didn't seem thrown off at all. She looked up at him, her expression soft but thoughtful. "Like what?" "Like caring about your customers. It's different from the others," he said, before realizing how odd that might have sounded. He quickly added, "I mean, it's a good thing. You're really engaged, not just going through the motions." Jasmine's smile widened, a flash of understanding crossing her face. She didn't seem offended, but rather intrigued. "I guess I've always thought it's about more than just checking people out. It's about making sure they feel seen, you know? You'd be surprised how much people just want to be acknowledged. Life gets busy, and sometimes this is the only place they get to interact with someone." Thomas blinked, taking in her words. A part of him had always known that business wasn't just about transactions, but it had been easy to forget. He had been too focused on growth, efficiency, and maximizing profit margins to think about the personal touch. Jasmine, however, seemed to have found something he had lost. The heart of the business. She continued bagging his groceries with the same careful precision, but her eyes never left his. "I don't know. I just like making someone's day a little better, even if it's just for a few minutes." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure why her words resonated so deeply. Maybe it was the sincerity in her voice. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long while, he realized how much people like Jasmine were the true foundation of any business. Not the products, the stock, or the profits. For a moment he said nothing. His mind raced as he processed everything she had said. It was simple, almost too simple. But there was an undeniable truth in her words that had eluded him for far too long. But now, as the conversation shifted, Thomas had a choice to make. Would he leave it at that, or would he take this moment further? The hum of the store continued around them as Jasmine finished bagging Thomas's groceries. The line behind him was still growing, but it was as though the chaos of the surrounding scene had faded. All that mattered for those brief moments was this conversation. It was strange. Thomas hadn't planned on spending so much time here, but now he didn't want to leave. There was something in Jasmine's words, in her approach to life and work, that was deeply unsettling, in a good way. He glanced over his shoulder, feeling the pressure of the impatient customers behind him. But he couldn't help it. He needed to know more, needed to understand how someone like Jasmine had found a way to balance the demands of her job while maintaining such a grounded, personal connection with the people around her. Something inside Thomas stirred, an unfamiliar mix of guilt and inspiration. "Jasmine," he began, his voice quiet but earnest. "I have to ask, do you ever get frustrated with how things are here?" He paused for a moment, weighing his words carefully. With how the job is treated. Her smile faltered for just a second. Jasmine didn't answer right away, as if considering the question. Thomas could sense the shift. It wasn't a simple question. It was something deeper. He wasn't just asking about the logistics of her job. He was asking about her purpose. She looked up at him, eyes wide with sincerity, and sighed softly. All the time, actually. But the way I see it is, we can't change the whole system by ourselves, but we can change how we show up. We can change how we treat people, even if it's just one person at a time. That's the only control I have, you know. Her words hit him hard. Thomas hadn't expected her to say that. He had asked her a question he thought would be met with frustration, perhaps even bitterness. But Jasmine's response was refreshing, honest and real, not clouded by disillusionment. She had found a way to navigate a job that many would see as a dead end, without letting it diminish her sense of self-worth. She wasn't just doing the work. She was embodying a philosophy, a way of life. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. The awkwardness of the moment felt like it was slowly dissolving. What she had said made so much sense, but it also made him reflect on his own choices, his own priorities. Was he guilty of treating his employees like faceless numbers on a report? Had he lost touch with the people who made his company thrive? I've been doing things wrong. Thomas muttered to himself, more to himself than Jasmine. He realized that all his years in the business world had blinded him to the very thing that made a company successful. The people, the employees like Jasmine, were the true driving force behind it all. Jasmine paused for a moment, as if contemplating his words. I get it. It's not easy, she said softly, but it's the little things that matter. You just have to find the right balance. Thomas looked at her, struck by how wise she was for someone so young. There was something raw and genuine in her voice, something that made him feel like he had been walking around with his eyes closed for far too long. You know, he said, leaning in slightly, I'm actually the owner of this store. Jasmine blinked, clearly surprised. She seemed to take a moment to process what he had just said, and then the realization hit her. The warmth in her eyes faltered, and she quickly straightened her posture, a brief flash of uncertainty crossing her face. You're the owner? She asked, her voice a mixture of shock and curiosity. Thomas nodded. Yeah, I'm Thomas Miller. I came in today to observe things, to see how my employees were doing. I didn't expect to see all this. He gestured around the store, though it wasn't the physical space he was referring to. It was the spirit, the energy, the human connection. He had been too focused on the wrong things for too long. Jasmine seemed to relax, and the smile that had momentarily faltered returned. Well, I'm glad you saw something positive. I guess I wasn't sure what to expect either, she said with a small laugh. But it's nice to know that someone notices. Thomas's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and realization. I've been running this business all wrong. I've been thinking about numbers, margins, and deadlines. I've been focusing on all the wrong things, and I forgot what really makes this work. People like you. Jasmine looked down for a moment, and when she met his gaze again, there was a quiet pride in her eyes. It's not just me, she said softly. There are a lot of people out there who just want to be seen and heard. It's about recognizing that it's the people who matter. Thomas took a deep breath, a sense of clarity washing over him. But he knew that this moment was just the beginning. The question now was, what would he do with this newfound understanding? As the conversation between Thomas and Jasmine continued, a weight seemed to settle on Thomas's shoulders. It was as if the entire conversation had been a mirror, showing him everything he had been neglecting in his business, everything he had been taking for granted. He glanced around the store, once again noting the mechanical movements of the other employees, the indifference with which they went about their jobs. It wasn't that they were bad people, far from it, but something was missing. There was no heart behind the work, no real connection to the customers, no passion, and he had missed it. Jasmine, in contrast, stood as a beacon of what could be. She hadn't been doing anything revolutionary. There were no grand gestures, no huge changes to how things were done. It was her approach, her attitude, her ability to see people as more than transactions that had made all the difference. She hadn't waited for permission to change the way she interacted with customers. She simply did it, and it had an undeniable effect. Thomas leaned against the counter, his thoughts swirling in every direction. How many of his employees were like Jasmine, but too afraid to show it? How many had he overlooked simply because they didn't fit the corporate mold he had created? How many had been disheartened by the relentless focus on profits, efficiency, and targets? His heart felt heavy as he thought about all the missed opportunities to build a culture of care within his company. "I've been so focused on the numbers," Thomas said softly, almost to himself. "The quarterly reports, the metrics. I've lost sight of the people behind it all." Jasmine looked up at him, her expression kind but understanding. "It happens," she said simply. "It's easy to forget, but it's never too late to change." Thomas's eyes met hers, and in that moment he realized that the shift in perspective didn't have to come from a huge corporate overhaul. It could start with something much simpler, something that didn't require a massive budget or months of restructuring. It could start with a change in attitude, a change in how he approached his employees, how he valued them. He straightened up, a decision beginning to form in his mind. He could change the culture of his company. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. All it would take was time, patience, and a willingness to listen. He had been neglecting his employees for far too long, assuming they were just cogs in the machine. But they were more than that. They were the heartbeat of the business. They were the ones interacting with the customers every day, the ones who could make or break a customer's experience. "What if I told you that this store could be different?" Thomas asked, his voice gaining confidence. "What if I could make sure that every employee here feels valued, like they matter?" Jasmine's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "That would be amazing," she said simply. "But you can't just talk about it. You have to show it. People can sense when something's genuine." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already racing with ideas. He could start small, focusing on one store at a time. He could implement a training program that prioritized customer connections over efficiency. He could encourage managers to get to know their employees, not just as workers, but as people with lives and stories. And he could foster an environment where kindness, empathy, and respect were the cornerstones of the business, not just buzzwords on a poster. "I'll start with you," Thomas said, looking Jasmine in the eye. "I'll start by recognizing how much you're doing, and then I'll make sure everyone else sees it too." Jasmine looked at him, clearly taken aback by the sincerity in his words. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, clearly moved. "You don't have to say anything," Thomas replied with a smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing." As he stood there, feeling the weight of his decision, Thomas realized that Jasmine had given him more than just insight into customer service. She had shown him how to be a better leader, how to connect with people on a human level, not just as a business owner or a boss. She had reminded him that success wasn't just about profits, it was about relationships, about people, about making each interaction count. But now, the real work was just beginning. Would Thomas follow through with the changes he had promised, or would his old habits pull him back? The days that followed that chance encounter at the supermarket were some of the most transformative of Thomas's career. He couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Jasmine. Each time he walked into his office, he felt a weight settle on his chest, a reminder of the promises he had made to himself. Jasmine's words echoed in his mind. "It's about how you show up." It was simple, but profound. The work ahead of him wouldn't be easy. It would require a shift in how he viewed his employees and his role as a leader. But it was a shift he was willing to make. Thomas didn't waste time. He immediately called a series of meetings with his senior management team, explaining what he had witnessed in the supermarket. He spoke candidly, sharing his realization that the company had become too focused on growth and efficiency and had forgotten the human element, the one thing that truly drove customer loyalty. He told them about Jasmine, the cashier who had shown him the importance of making each customer feel valued. They listened intently, but Thomas could see the skepticism in their eyes. They were used to focusing on the numbers, the metrics, the immediate results. They didn't yet understand the shift he wanted to make. But Thomas was determined. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, his revelation would be nothing more than a passing thought. He had to show them, not just tell them. Over the next few weeks, he began putting his ideas into action. He started by visiting stores in person, just as he had done that fateful afternoon. This time, he wasn't there to observe from the shadows. He was there to engage with the employees, to get to know them, to ask about their experiences. And just like Jasmine had done, he treated them as people, not just workers. At first, the employees were surprised. They had never seen Thomas so hands-on, so willing to spend time with them. They had always known him as the big boss, who came around only when there were problems to solve. But this was different. This time, Thomas listened. He didn't just ask about sales and productivity. He asked about their lives, their challenges, and how they felt about their work. And in return, they opened up to him in a way they never had before. It wasn't long before the change began to take root. Employees began to feel more seen, more heard. They started to take more pride in their work, not because they were told to, but because they felt valued. The shift wasn't just about customer service anymore. It was about creating a culture of respect and connection within the company. Thomas wasn't perfect, and the change didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks, moments where he had to remind himself of the bigger picture. But with each passing day, the company began to feel different. The employees too began to see the value in what they were doing. They understood that it wasn't just about selling products. It was about creating experiences, fostering relationships, and making customers feel heard. It was about going beyond the transaction and connecting with people on a personal level. But the most significant change came when Thomas returned to the store where it had all started. His visit to Jasmine's checkout counter. This time he didn't just visit to observe, he visited to thank her. When Jasmine saw him walk through the door, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Miller, what are you doing here?" she asked, clearly not expecting him to return. "I'm here to thank you," Thomas said, smiling, "for reminding me what really matters." Jasmine blinked, clearly unsure of how to respond. I don't know what to say. I was just doing my job." "You were doing more than that," Thomas said with a soft chuckle. "You showed me something I had forgotten, that a business is built on people. Not just customers, but employees. It's the small things, the kindness, the connection, that make all the difference." Jasmine smiled, her eyes bright with appreciation. "I'm just glad it made a difference," she said. Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle within him. The company was changing, but more importantly, he was changing. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or making decisions from a distance. It was about showing up, being present, and valuing people for who they were, not just for what they could produce. As he left the store that day, Thomas felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. He knew the work wasn't over, but he also knew that he was on the right path now. The road ahead would have its challenges, but he was no longer focused on the numbers. He was focused on the people, their stories, their needs, their humanity. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas Miller felt truly fulfilled in his role as a leader. But as he continued his journey, Thomas understood that leadership wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process of learning, growing, and adapting. The real question was, what kind of leader would he choose to be every day? As time passed, Thomas Miller's transformation rippled through his company, from the way he engaged with his employees to the way they interacted with customers. The change wasn't sudden, but it was real. Thomas had shifted from focusing solely on profits and numbers to realizing that at the core of every business, no matter how large or small, were the people who made it all happen. He began visiting stores regularly, not just as the owner, but as someone who truly cared. And with each visit, he noticed the difference. The employees who once seemed disconnected were now engaged, eager to make the shopping experience better for every customer. The customers themselves began to feel it too, a warmer atmosphere, more attention, and an overall sense that they were more than just a transaction. But the real power of this change lay in the subtle moments, the small gestures that had once been overlooked, the smiles, the little bits of small talk, the simple act of seeing people for who they were. These were the things that turned a mundane shopping trip into something memorable. And it all started with one conversation. One woman, Jasmine, who chose to make a difference, no matter how small, and reminded Thomas of the power of human connection. It was a simple truth. but one that so many business owners and leaders overlook. People matter. They always have, and they always will. And it's through those connections, those moments of genuine interaction, that businesses truly thrive. So, as you watch this story unfold, think about the moments in your own life where a simple act of kindness made all the difference. Think about the people you encounter every day, and how you can make them feel seen, heard, and valued. Whether it's a smile to a cashier, a kind word to a colleague, or just taking the time to listen, your actions can change the course of someone's day, and even their life. We all have the power to make a difference. Sometimes it just takes a small shift in perspective to see that the things that matter most aren't always the ones we focus on. Thomas's journey is a reminder that the human element is the heart of any business, and that success isn't measured by the numbers. It's measured by the relationships we build, the lives we touch, and the kindness we share. If you've been inspired by this story, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Take a moment today to make someone feel valued. And remember, the smallest acts of kindness can leave a lasting impact. Because when you show up with your whole heart, you never know who you might change along the way.